The original Star Wars, later renamed A New Hope, was released on May 25, 1977. Since then, that galaxy far, far away has spun out into becoming its own entire universe over the past 26 years. So now, after the 46th anniversary of Star Wars itself, which was May 25th, 2023, let's take a look at how Star Wars has grown and changed throughout the past half-century that it's been around. The results of the breakdown might just surprise you. I know they surprised me. So, here we go, because this is the deep dive. When breaking histories into eras, people often break times into six. 6 eras of classical music, 6 eras of universal history, 6 eras of personal development, 6 eras of business development, etc. Just a quick Google search for the 6 eras of returns more than 7 billion results, covering everything from history to economics to science to psychology. There are even 6 classic episodes of Star Wars itself. When dividing time periods into eras, it seems that 6 is a good way to go, and I kind of get that. It nicely divides anything into 3 historical eras and 3 more modern eras, which is great because people love a story, and the number 3 generates that naturally with a beginning, a middle, and an end. So today we're going to look at the 6 eras of Star Wars, the beginning, the middle, and the end of the old, but also the beginning, middle, and end of the new. But I didn't just want to decide for myself based on my own experience what these 6 eras would be. That just didn't sound interesting. Given my personal focuses, likes and dislikes, and place on the Star Wars timeline for my own life, it just didn't seem scientific enough to break it down based on my own personal perspective. And of course that would be uniquely boring, because of course I already know my own perspective, so I wouldn't be learning anything new. No, the better way to go about this is to take the total time Star Wars has been around and divide it into 6 equal eras of time up to its 46th anniversary, so that we can truly get some perspective on what happened when and how things developed. And somehow, just by breaking it up like this, the results shocked me, but they also make perfect sense all at once. Let's see what you think of it. It's really amazing the context this provides when you break it into chunks like this. And, luckily, we just passed that 46th anniversary of A New Hope, so the time is perfectly divisible into exactly 6 equal eras, spanning each 7 years and 8 months. For each era, I'll be going through my name for it, the time period it spans, the movies, shows, games, highs, lows, and my own personal connections. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Number 1. The Classic Era. May 25th, 1977 to January 25th, 1985. The first era of Star Wars was where it all began. Everything that made the original Star Wars, the original trilogy, what it came from, was within this first era of Star Wars. The release of A New Hope, The Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi were all during this first era. And already during the first era, the spin-offs were beginning. The Holiday Special, the Ewok Adventure, all of these spin-off movies released during this initial period. There were no real prominent TV shows yet to speak of, but there was the start of Star Wars video games already during this first era. Return of the Jedi, Death Star Battle, Jedi Arena, and Star Wars Arcade all released for Atari, along with 2 other Atari games, both called The Empire Strikes Back. These first games were simple, but they captured the Star Wars spirit with what technology was available at the time, and they laid the groundwork for much bigger Star Wars games that were to come. As for tabletop games, Star Wars started off really strong with classics like Destroy the Death Star, Escape the Death Star, the collectible card game, the Starfighter Battle Book, the Death Star War Game Book, the Corellian Smuggler Game Book, the Hoth Adventure Game, the Lightsaber Dueling Book, Escape the Death Star action figure game, and Battle of the Sarlacc Pit. A lot of Death Stars, a lot of adventure books, but I'm sure there's still a ton I'm missing. I've only played about half of these games myself, but the ones that I've tried have all been a blast, actually. Obviously, the original trilogy coming out in the first era is the biggest, most important event here, but I would even argue that the second biggest is just the sheer amount of tabletop games that came. All of them actually pretty amazing and based on Star Wars right away during this initial period. Every single one is made with so much care and creativity that even today, 40-something years later, they're still worth looking up as free online printouts and just trying for yourself. None of them really got much popularity, but that just makes these hidden gems even more special to me. The trend of independent expanded universe books being tied to Star Wars lore also began during this first era, with books like movie novelizations that go into more depth, a Han Solo series, a Lando Calrissian series, and Splinter of the Mind's Eye, the first ever Star Wars expanded universe book published, which explored Luke and Leia's adventures between A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back. Overall, this first era of Star Wars was where the core of it was born, and where most of the trends began. For those who were an adult during this era, I'm sure it must have been one magical time where every new year brought some sort of new fun Star Wars original trilogy surprise. And for the kids who grew up with the original trilogy releases, that must have just made the stories even more magical. For myself personally, I wasn't born yet during this era, so I have no personal experience with it. But my dad was one of those kids who grew up with the original trilogy, and I've never seen someone love a fictional universe as much as he loves that one that he grew up with. I don't know if every kid in the generation grew up memorizing the script of Empire Strikes Back, learning Greedo's Huttese lines from A New Hope, and playing all those old Atari games and card games like you're really there in the Battle of Hoth. But at least for my dad, I can see it was an experience that can never be replaced. But that brings us to number 2, the Lost Era. January 26, 1985 to September 25, 1992. The second era of Star Wars almost didn't exist. Star Wars could easily have stopped after the original movie, and it could even more easily have just stopped after Return of the Jedi. But the people who experienced that first era of Star Wars just knew it was too good to let it go, no matter what. Which brings us to the Lost Era. An era where almost nothing happened except the bare-bones continuation of Star Wars and the earliest, smallest seeds of that new expanded universe beyond the original trilogy. This era had no new movies except the spin-off Ewoks: The Battle for Endor, but it did have some shows, namely Droids and Ewoks. Nothing too fancy, but Lucasfilm did keep making content to remind people that Star Wars existed and to get the next generation of kids involved. For video games, there was nothing too fancy again, but a solid continuation of previous developments. This era showcased Star Wars on the original Nintendo NES, with games based on A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back. There was also a stark lack of board games during the second era, with the only publications being some adventure game books and a few board games. They're fine books, but at least the few board games from this time were really incredible. Assault on Hoth and The Battle for Endor are two of the most fun Star Wars board games I've ever played. The Expanded Universe novels also continued chugging along, with only a few new additions. One was a book series called Jedi Prince, taking place between A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back, and the other was the famous Thrawn Trilogy by Timothy Zahn. I've never personally read either, to be honest, but the Thrawn Trilogy is by far the more famous of the two. The Thrawn Trilogy is seen by many as the original proper sequel trilogy. 3 detailed, well-written books and an epic trilogy about Han, Luke, Leia, and Chewbacca taking on a new threat after the fall of the Empire. This book series, on its own, kept Star Wars alive through this entire second era. It kept that weakening flame of Star Wars fandom alive, with new good content long enough to survive until the more heavy hitters could follow up from this base. And the legacy of this trilogy lives on even today, with Timothy Zahn continuing to write new Star Wars books, Grand Admiral Thrawn becoming a fan favorite in shows like Rebels to this day, and the character even being expected to make a major appearance in the upcoming Ahsoka Tano show, which is said to be loosely inspired by this original Thrawn trilogy. It's notable that this second era of Star Wars also produced the Dark Empire comic book series, another story taking place after Return of the Jedi, but with less nuanced storytelling. From what I hear, they're a fun romp, but full of odd ideas, key among them being that the Emperor comes back from the dead. This comic series was actually the inspiration for the later Rise of Skywalker movie, so its cultural impact is mixed, to say the least. The second era of Star Wars was almost nothing. No new movies, shows, not many tabletop games, video games, or even many books of any real note beyond the Thrawn trilogy. Not a lot happened. But what matters for this era is less what did happen and more about what did not. Star Wars did not die. People did not forget it. They kept making small things about it, and they kept talking about it, and they kept caring for it. And that's what mattered. I still wasn't born yet during this second era, but my dad was a teenager at the time. I've seen his love for the Thrawn trilogy, those old Nintendo games, and even the older media from the original era of Star Wars. And looking at the gap of content here, I can totally see why he liked the original trilogy stuff from his own childhood so much. Star Wars was ending. It was over. The trilogy was finished and no new content was coming out for the entire second era. At that point, there were no eras of Star Wars. There was just the original trilogy and then basically nothing. People held on to what they could get their hands on, and they watched and rewatched the old movies whenever they could. This was the era where Star Wars survived. Which brings us to number 3, the Phantom Menace era, September 26th, 1992 to May 25th, 2000. You like Star Wars? You felt sad that no major releases occurred during the second era? Well, here you go, take all the Star Wars you can handle and more. I was shocked to realize that the Phantom Menace had its own entire era in the Star Wars timeline when you break things up evenly. But looking at its position and how it affected the fans and the franchise and the sheer unfathomable amount of merchandise that went along with it, it's not hard to see why it did have its own era. For movies, this era obviously featured Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, the first prequel film. For TV shows, nothing new came out, shockingly. But then we get to the video games. Super Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back, and Super Star Wars Return of the Jedi all came out for the Super Nintendo. Meanwhile, on PC you could play X-Wing, TIE Fighter, X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter, X-Wing Alliance, Rebel Assault 2, Star Wars Arcade, Dark Forces 2, Masters of Terrascasi, The Yoda Stories, Shadows of the Empire, DroidWorks, Rogue Squadron, Star Wars Chess, and one I have a lot of personal nostalgia for, the classic game of Star Wars Monopoly for PC. Some of these games were also playable on the new Nintendo 64, and this era also came out with the Star Wars Trilogy Arcade, the best Star Wars arcade game ever made to this day, at least in my opinion. Now at this point you might be thinking, hey, whoa, wait up, that's a lot of video games. But actually none of them have anything to do with the Phantom Menace. And you'd be right. These are all the other games that came out during the same era before the Phantom Menace. We also had the Phantom Menace video game, Pod Racer, Gungan Frontier, Yoda's Challenge, Pit Droids, Anakin Speedway, Jedi Power Battles, Force Commander, Star Wars Activity Center, Jabba's Game Galaxy, and Jar Jar's Journey. These ones clearly aren't as impressive, they're mostly just tie-in games for children. And that was the trend during this era. As the Phantom Menace came out, the old original trilogy universe got a lot of exciting new content that really made it what it is today. Those old Nintendo games, Dark Forces, Jedi Knight, flight combat simulators, all of those things and everything else that came with them were a huge and sudden explosion of amazing original trilogy gaming content that still holds up today as some of the best Star Wars games ever made. But the Phantom Menace? A movie aimed more at kids, with a bunch of new games for it, which were also aimed more at kids. Virtually nothing tying the original trilogy crowd to this new movie. This disconnect in the games really exposes issues with the way that fans were treated during this time. After an entire Star Wars era of waiting for new content, they suddenly got some of the best Star Wars media ever made all at once, all based on the original trilogy and leading up to a brand new Star Wars movie for the first time in years. But that movie? The Phantom Menace. And after that, a bunch of mediocre media aimed at younger children. Something had changed, and fans weren't happy about it. Star Wars had always been about growing up, but it was never targeted as only a kids' show. This was a major miscalculation by George Lucas that really hurt the brand, the story, and the business. For tabletop gaming, Attack on Naboo, Clash of the Lightsabers, Jar Jar Adventure, and the Young Jedi card game, as well as the Phantom Menace customizable card game, all came out during this time, but they were all aimed at young children as well. The Queen's Gambit, a board game, also came out, which I've heard is famously one of the most creative and thematic amazing Star Wars board games ever made, and that one is a hit with adults, but I myself haven't had a chance to try it yet, although I would love to. Overall, the Phantom Menace era was one of suddenly increasing Star Wars hype, followed by a new focus on much younger audiences all of a sudden. This is the era that I was born in, but not one that I remember much due to me being so young at the time. I know that I saw The Phantom Menace at the movie theater when it came out, and it's the first movie I ever saw when my dad took me. And I know that I had a bunch of those amazing original trilogy and after video games from that hype period, and I really loved them growing up. But for me, this era is more like the preamble to my own connection with Star Wars. Which brings us to number 4, the prequel era, May 26th, 2000 to January 25th, 2008. The movies that came out during this era were, of course, Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. This era was also the origin of many great TV shows and parodies, from Robot Chicken Star Wars to Family Guy Star Wars, and of course the fantastic 2003 Clone Wars 2D animated series. It was a fantastic time to be a Star Wars fan, with great new movies and fun shows all the time. And don't even get me started on the video games. As anyone who lived through this era knows, this was the golden age of Star Wars gaming. Whether you're on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, or however you play, there were so many games to choose from. We had Demolition, Battle for Naboo, Obi-Wan's Adventures, Starfighter, Jedi Starfighter, Bombad Racing, Galactic Battlegrounds, Rogue Squadron 2, Rogue Squadron 3, Flight of the Falcon, Obi-Wan, Bounty Hunter, Attack of the Clones, The Clone Wars, Racer Revenge, Jedi Outcast, Jedi Academy, The New Droid Army, Galaxies, Knights of the Old Republic, Knights of the Old Republic 2, Battlefront, Battlefront 2, Battlefront Renegade Squadron, Apprentice of the Force, Republic Commando, Empire at War, Lethal Alliance, Revenge of the Sith. So many I can't even keep up. Lego Star Wars, Lego Star Wars 2, Lego Star Wars The Complete Saga, and a ton of Flash games for PC hosted on StarWars.com, along with a bunch of new mobile games for cell phones. If you like video games, you should go through and try to pick up just about every single one of these games from the prequel era, or at least play them on an emulator. Star Wars gaming reached a peak here that it's never fully been able to recapture. Many of these games are considered the best Star Wars games ever made, and for good reason. This was the point when Star Wars hype was at an all-time high during the lead-up to Revenge of the Sith, as people waited to see how the prequels would connect to the original trilogy, and Lucasfilm just let game developers run wild with any idea they had for an awesome experience in the Star Wars universe. For board games, there unfortunately were not as many during this era, but a few fun classics did come out, like Jedi Unleashed, Star Wars Stratego, Clone Wars Risk, Original Trilogy Risk, Star Wars The Game of Life, and most notably, Star Wars Epic Duels, a really fun, light, miniatures battle game. This era was also perhaps the golden era of Star Wars for the expanded universe novels too, with plenty of new series coming out to fill in all the gaps between episodes for our favorite characters. But at least for me, this was the best time for the Star Wars expanded universe novels. Just look at these amazing book series that came out during this time. Dark Nest, The New Jedi Order, and Legacy of the Force all expanded the storyline after Return of the Jedi. Jedi Apprentice, Jedi Quest, and The Last of the Jedi are 3 interconnected series that followed Obi-Wan's journey before Episode 1, between Episodes 1 and 2, and after Episode 3, filling in all of Obi-Wan's gaps for the entire prequel trilogy. These 3 Obi-Wan series are some of my favorite in all of Star Wars just because of how much it shows the daily life of Jedi during peacetime, with Qui-Gon training Obi-Wan, Obi-Wan training the young Anakin, and also Obi-Wan trying to help rebuild the Jedi after the end of Revenge of the Sith. Boba Fett and Republic Commando were also both series, giving looks behind the scenes of the Clone Army and delving deeper into the story of how Boba Fett grew up into the bounty hunter of the original trilogy. I know that the later Clone Wars TV show also goes into this a bit, but I have to say the original books just did it so much better. And finally, there was also the Darth Bane trilogy, the most intense and in-depth look at the history and origin of the Sith ever published for Star Wars. And on top of that, we also got lots of classic individual books diving into the specific missions of specific characters and how they affected them. Rogue Planet, Darth Maul, Cloak of Deception, Shatterpoint, The Cestus Deception, Dark Rendezvous, Labyrinth of Evil, Secrets of the Jedi, Outbound Flight, Death Star, and Allegiance. Every series and every standalone book I've listed here from this era is a real treasure that I highly recommend you check out. And that's not even to mention the fantastic novelizations of Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith that came out during this time. Also, the old Phantom Menace novelization by Terry Brooks is another amazing standout that you should read with these two. The novelization of Revenge of the Sith by Matthew Stover, though, is my favorite book of all time, Star Wars or not, and I've read it or listened to the audiobook literally hundreds of times now, with a lot of the passages memorized. That Revenge of the Sith novelization is also the highest production quality audiobook I've ever listened to in my life, so I actually recommend it as an audiobook more than anything. If you only ever read one Star Wars book, make it the audiobook of The Revenge of the Sith by Matthew Stover. This era was my childhood, so the movies and games hold such a special place for me as the most nostalgic in all of Star Wars. Attack of the Clones is my most nostalgic movie, while Revenge of the Sith is my favorite. All of these amazing games still hold up as the pinnacle of Star Wars video gaming for technical reasons, but also for my own memories of just playing them with my little brother. The prequel era was off to a rocky start as people compared it to the original trilogy's more adult-oriented media, but I feel like once it got going, this time it really shined. There's something amazing about this era, like lightning in a bottle, that just can't ever be fully caught again. But they definitely tried, and they did come quite close to recreating this magic with the next era, number 5, the Clone Wars era, January 26th, 2008 to September 25th, 2015. Being one of the more recent eras, I'm sure you're all very familiar with everything that's come from the Clone Wars. For movies, we of course have the Clone Wars 3D animated movie, but honestly, that doesn't really count because it was just some episodes from the middle of the show attached together. By the way, if you're looking to get into the Clone Wars animated show or any of the other Star Wars shows, know that the episodes were produced wildly out of order to the point that it really breaks the story. That's why if you do want to follow the individual arcs one by one to get that high emotional impact, I highly recommend checking out my Clone Wars watch order video linked in the description. But during this era, we did get Clone Wars Season 1 through 6, and also Star Wars Rebels Seasons 1 and 2 to continue the story. Most people know about the Clone Wars and they love it, but I also have to recommend Star Wars Rebels here. Once you get past the more cartoonish art style, I think that Rebels actually has deeper characters and a better core to it when you get into things. It also continues all the stories from the Clone Wars, so it's like extra bonus seasons of your favorite characters. Definitely worth checking out if you haven't already. And as you might imagine for the Clone Wars era, the video games we got were mostly Clone Wars themed. But more importantly, the overall quality of video games had really a significant drop-off during this era. The best we got was The Force Unleashed, a great game. But everything else, very questionable quality. Just listen to this. Force Unleashed 2, Battlefront Elite Squadron, Kinect Star Wars Angry Birds, Star Wars Angry Birds 2, Star Wars Pinball, Lightsaber Duels, Jedi Alliance, Republic Heroes, LEGO Star Wars 3, The Clone Wars Adventures, the MMO, the Old Republic MMO, and a bunch of random iPhone mobile apps. I have some great memories of these games, and I'm sure many of you do too, but they are objectively not well-made or well-polished games. Beyond The Force Unleashed, the only one I can really praise is Lightsaber Duels, for also having some fun use of the Wii remote as the lightsaber, and I suppose Star Wars Kinect just for being so creative. But overall, the games from this era just suddenly got pretty bad. It might have something to do with the Clone Wars taking over, the aim of Lucasfilm directing back towards younger children, or the fact that Lucasfilm was preparing to sell to Disney during this era. But wow, the lack of good games here was a little bit staggering. But what about board games? Well, we got X-Wing, Armada, and Imperial Assault. 3 miniature war games that I haven't personally played, but at least they're pretty good in reviews. Other than those, just a couple random games aimed at children of no particular note. We got the card game, Empire vs. Rebellion, which is fun, but small and simple. The Clone Wars era was rough for video games, but it was even rougher for tabletop gaming. And for books, actually not as bad as it could have been. All the series from the prequel era finally got their endings, so that was nice. And a few new series worth mentioning came out, such as Rebel Force, Coruscant Knights, The Clone Wars, and Fate of the Jedi. Of these, the only one I've actually read was Rebel Force, which was a great series about the Empire hunting Luke after A New Hope, but the other three series sound interesting to me too. Coruscant Knights follows a Jedi hiding on Coruscant after Order 66. The Clone Wars follows clone troopers through, you guessed it, the Clone Wars. And The Fate of the Jedi continues the original expanded universe stories way past the end of Return of the Jedi. The standalone books Darth Plagueis and Tarkin also both came out during this time, which I actually haven't read either of those either, but I've heard really good things about both of them. So for Star Wars novels, I suppose it was still a pretty good era. But of course, Lucasfilm spent much of this era preparing for the Disney buyout. And then Disney officially took control at the end of 2012, leading to number 6, the Disney era, September 26, 2015 through May 25th, 2023. Pretty much everything not yet mentioned in this video made before this video has come to us from this latest era of Star Wars, the first Disney era. And Disney moved fast. This era included the highest number of movies by far. The entire sequel trilogy, Solo and Rogue One, all came out during this single era. And for TV, we had the conclusion of the Clone Wars, the end of Rebels, Mandalorian Seasons 1, 2, and 3, The Book of Boba Fett, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Andor, The Bad Batch Seasons 1 and 2, Star Wars Resistance, Tales of the Jedi, and Star Wars Visions, along with a bunch of smaller shows and spin-offs online. Now keep in mind, each era of this list is the exact same length of time. This is just how much Disney has crammed into the short time they've controlled Star Wars. Comparing this with the content of previous eras, you can see just how fast Disney's pace of creating Star Wars was, pumping out show after show and movie after movie for better or worse. And people's views on the quality of this is very dependent on what parts of Star Wars they like the most. But for me, I'd say the high points were Rogue One and Season 7 of the Clone Wars. Other than those two, and even Season 7 of the Clone Wars had some mixed elements that weren't perfect by any means, I'd say the Disney era has been very mixed and, frankly, rather disappointing to most people. Coming off the Clone Wars era, it felt like another step in the wrong direction of aiming content more and more at kids, while also choosing quantity over quality for most of the new content coming out, even if some of it was pretty fun. The days of the original trilogy and the prequel eras are gone, at least for now, and things feel more like they did during the Phantom Menace era, the Clone Wars era, and the Lost era. But still, let's take a look at some of the recent video games. There's a lot of small spin-off games, of course, but the big names from this time period were LEGO Star Wars The Force Awakens, LEGO Star Wars The Skywalker Saga, and the new Star Wars Battlefront 1 and 2, as well as Jedi Fallen Order and its sequel Jedi Survivor. Of these, the only one that really connected with me in the long run was the Jedi Fallen Order series. The story felt pretty lackluster to me, honestly, but the gameplay was the closest you can be to feeling like a true Jedi Padawan and using all your lightsaber and force skills to overcome challenges. On the other hand, the new LEGO games do look pretty, but they don't have as much story or gameplay depth as the old ones did, and the new Battlefront reboots have the same issues for me, despite how popular they are. But there's another new frontier of Star Wars gaming that started during this era with a lot of promise, and that is virtual reality. VR headsets have gotten Vader Immortal, Squadrons, Tales from the Galaxy's Edge, Star Wars Pinball, and a lot of Star Wars mods for other popular games that even let you play things like Battlefront in VR. I still don't have a VR headset of my own, so I haven't gotten to try any of these games yet, but the potential here alone is something to look forward to. And even the games that have already been released or just modded to look like Star Wars are incredible. If there's one thing the future of Star Wars holds from this era that really got kickstarted, It's the virtual reality scene. I can't wait to see where those go. And honestly, even the tabletop gaming scene hasn't been bad this era. We got Rebellion, the living card game, Destiny, the deck building game, Clone Wars Pandemic, and Outer Rim with its expansion. Not too many when you count them all up, but there are some heavy hitters there. Rebellion and its Rogue One expansion is the closest you can get to a massive board game simulating the entire original trilogy against a friend, while Outer Rim and its expansion is absolutely the most thematic Star Wars board game I've ever seen. Both of them give you total flexibility to remake the entire Star Wars story however you want. Whether as the Empire, the Rebels, or a random smuggler or bounty hunter just trying to make his way in the universe. But as for books, I'm honestly not even going to make a full list here. Disney has cranked out so many new Star Wars books over the years, and almost all of them are poorly written sequel tie-in books that contradict the original expanded universe and even contradict themselves internally. They're just not worth trying from everything I've heard about them. From the very detailed and well-maintained expanded universe to Disney just throwing everything away to build their own Jenga tower of novels that immediately crumbled with no oversight, it was just depressing. Star Wars novels took the largest hit of anything during this era, and I'm not sure if it will ever recover, to be honest. There are some standouts, like the amazing Rogue One novelization and its even better prequel, Catalyst, along with some popular standouts I haven't read yet, like the new Thrawn and Ahsoka series, and some standalone books about Qui-Gon Jinn and Count Dooku. But other than that, from what I hear, it's been mostly just Disney replacing the old EU with new books of insanely lesser quality, and recently starting to dive into the High Republic era, which I've heard is basically just Disney trying to replace the Old Republic with their own shoddily made, worse quality version of the expanded universe. Part of why I cherish the Star Wars books from previous eras so much is because Disney went so out of their way to eliminate all the old expanded universe canon. They got rid of all the old books despite their 5-era history of pretty good quality stories, only to replace them with these extremely shoddy, poorly managed Disney attempts to rewrite the entire story after Return of the Jedi, and even fill in a bunch of the old gaps between movies with their own things. I'm not interested in Disney's low quality work, and based on the sales numbers, it seems like most of you aren't either. Of everything that Disney's done, the good and the bad, eliminating the old Star Wars expanded universe and trying to replace it with this failing hollow shell they're running now was by far the worst. But still, Star Wars goes on with the good and the bad, and that's the end of the first 6 eras. But wait, as Yoda said in The Empire Strikes Back, no, there is another. Era number 7, The Future of Star Wars. May 26th, 2023 to August 25th, 2031. This is where we are now. This is where this video was made. No new movies in the works because Disney is Disney, but it sounds like plenty of new TV shows seem to be on the horizon. All the recent shows are continuing, The Bad Batch, The Mandalorian, Andor, and the rest, with a brand new show about Ahsoka coming out to continue storylines from The Mandalorian. I'm sure more books will come out as well, but I assume their quality will be about as low as the rest of Disney's failing EU. But at least the video games look kind of interesting, with a new open-world game called Star Wars Outlaws in the works, and doubtless some more to be announced soon. Honestly, the best news seems to be coming from the tabletop gaming sector so far, with a fantastic-looking new Star Wars deck-building game by Fantasy Flight. And since it's only a few months into the era as of me making this video, I guess we'll just have to wait and see what happens. Star Wars is definitely at a low point in many ways right now, with faltering TV show and book quality, no new movies, and lackluster video games slowly taking over. Although the Star Wars tabletop gaming scene seems to somehow be still full steam ahead with great quality projects. Good for them. But if there's one thing true about Star Wars, it's that there's always hope. Star Wars has had a lot of ups and downs and horizontal moves throughout its 6-era history, so now as we enter the 7th era of Star Wars content, here's to hoping that it's a surprisingly exciting one, and not just another dark age like after the original trilogy finished. This was a very interesting video for me, as I know each person has their own history with Star Wars, and their own strong thoughts on the different time periods. So go on down to the comments and let me know your personal ranking for these eras and what you've thought about each one. I'm super excited to see all your opinions. Also, if you haven't already, check out my video on the hidden details in Star Wars, shown on screen here. I guarantee there will be a few that you've never heard of before that will shock you. Thanks for watching, and until next time, this is Deep Dive, signing off.